On the morning of May 9, 1941, Eduard Wagner spread a series of maps across the planning table at Army High Command Headquarters in Zossen and began calculating distances he already knew would not work. The room smelled of paper and pipe smoke and the particular staleness of an office that had been occupied continuously through a winter of intensive planning, and the maps before him showed the Soviet Union in the flat, colorless abstraction of military cartography. Rivers marked, rail lines marked, roads marked where they existed and absent where they did not. Wagner was 49 years old, a son of a miller from the small Bavarian town of Kirchenlamitz, a compact and precise man who had spent his career inside the administrative machinery of the German army and understood with the clarity of a man who had spent years reading supply tables that armies did not move on courage. They moved on fuel, food, ammunition, and spare parts, delivered in sufficient quantities to the right place at the right time by a system that had to function under conditions that degraded every component of it simultaneously. He was the Quartermaster General of the German Army, and what the maps before him described was a planning assumption his calculations did not support. The operation Wagner was resourcing would commit over 3 million men to an advance across a front of approximately 2,900 kilometers into a country whose road network, measured against Western European standards, was not a road network in any meaningful sense. The Soviet Union possessed in the regions the Wehrmacht intended to cross a density of paved roads so sparse that German planners had been forced to classify dirt tracks as primary supply routes. The railway system that existed was built to a gauge, the distance between rails, that was 89 millimeters wider than the European standard, meaning that every kilometer of Soviet track captured by the advancing army would require relaying before German rolling stock could use it. The men responsible for that relaying, the railway engineer units that would follow behind the advance, had been allocated at a rate that assumed the conversion could keep pace with the operational timetable. Wagner's tables indicated it could not. He wrote his concerns with the methodical precision of an administrator who understood that a written record was the only instrument available to a staff officer who had been overruled. The documents he produced in the spring of 1941 did not make dramatic arguments, they made arithmetic ones. The forward supply radius, the maximum distance from a railhead at which a motorized division could be kept continuously supplied, was approximately 500 kilometers under the conditions the Eastern Front presented. Beyond that radius, the fuel consumed by the trucks carrying supplies to the front began to approach the fuel being delivered, and the net tonnage arriving at forward positions fell below the minimum required to sustain offensive operations. Wagner had calculated the point at which the Eastern advance would outrun its own supply system, and the point fell well short of Moscow. Approximately 200 kilometers to the south, in a different office in the same institutional complex, Georg Thomas was arriving at a complementary conclusion from a different direction. Thomas was 53 years old, the son of a manufacturer from Forchheim in Bavaria, a general who thought in the language of industrial production rather than operational maneuver. He headed the Wehrmacht's War Economy and Armaments Office, and the problem he was examining in the spring of 1941 was not whether Germany could advance into the Soviet Union, but whether Germany's industrial base could sustain a war against it if the advance did not produce the rapid collapse the operational planners assumed. His office had compiled production figures, raw material assessments, and stockpile analyses, and what they described was a German war economy operating without the reserves that a prolonged Eastern campaign would require. Thomas had reached his conclusions through a process of genuine economic analysis, and he had done what staff officers in functioning institutions do with conclusions that have policy implications. He had written them down, organized them into a formal memorandum, and submitted them through the proper channels to the men responsible for the decision. The memorandum reached its intended recipients in the spring of 1941. It was read. It was filed. The planning for Barbarossa continued without alteration. The operation that Wagner and Thomas had separately concluded was unsustainable began on June 22, 1941, and in its first 3 weeks it appeared to everyone who was not reading the supply tables to be proceeding exactly as planned.
The border encirclements consumed Soviet formations at a rate that generated optimism at every level of the German command structure, except the one level whose job was to count what remained in the supply depots behind the advancing columns. Wagner was counting. The numbers he recorded in his correspondence through late June and into July described a system running at the outer edge of its capacity before the operational objectives it was meant to support had been reached. The first visible fracture appeared in fuel. The Panzer groups driving east consumed diesel and gasoline at rates that the pre-war planning tables had estimated, and the actual road conditions immediately exceeded. Soviet roads that were classified as usable disintegrated under the weight of tracked vehicles and the wheel loads of the supply columns following behind them. A road that could support a horse-drawn cart for a decade could support a Panzer column for a morning, and what remained after the tanks passed was a rutted channel that reduced the speed of the trucks trying to catch them to a fraction of the planned rate. Drivers who had been allocated a specific number of hours to cover a specific distance arrived late if they arrived at all, and the gap between the fuel the forward formations needed and the fuel reaching them opened in the first week and widened steadily through the second.
Wagner's logistics staff developed workarounds with the resourcefulness that German staff officers applied to problems they had not been given the resources to solve properly. Fuel was airlifted to forward airfields when the road columns fell too far behind, a solution that consumed Luftwaffe transport capacity that had other requirements and that the Luftwaffe's own planning had not allocated for sustained supply operations. Horse-drawn columns were pushed forward alongside the motorized ones, moving at a pace that matched the degraded road conditions better than trucks did, and consuming fodder that had to be sourced locally, because shipping it from Germany would have required rail capacity that was already committed elsewhere. The improvisations worked, partially, for a time, at costs that were not visible in the operational summaries reporting the daily advance. The railway problem was worse and less improvable. The conversion of Soviet broad-gauge track to the European standard proceeded at a rate that the railway engineer units had been told to achieve and could not. The gangs laying new track or adjusting existing track worked in summer heat on lines that Soviet demolition teams had damaged during the retreat, through terrain that the pre-war maps had presented as more accessible than it was. By mid-July, the rail conversion had fallen behind the advance by a margin that Wagner's staff translated into supply tonnages. The gap between what the forward armies required daily and what was reaching them represented by late July approximately 2 to 3 days of operational consumption. An army fighting daily battles against an enemy that had not collapsed could not absorb a 2-day supply deficit indefinitely and maintain its offensive capacity. Thomas watched the operational situation from his office and recognized in its developing shape the outline of the scenario his memorandum had described. The stockpiles of fuel, rubber, and certain critical metals that German industry required to sustain production at wartime rates had not been built to the levels his analysis had recommended. The assumption underlying the production planning that the Eastern Campaign would conclude before the stockpile shortfalls became critical was the same assumption underlying the operational planning, that the Soviet state would break quickly. Thomas's job required him to plan for the contingency that it did not. His superiors had not authorized him to do so, and the planning that resulted from that constraint was visible now in requisition forms that could not be filled and production schedules that could not be met. Wagner wrote to the Army High Command in late July that the logistical situation on the Central Axis was becoming critical. The letter was precise, factual, and largely unwelcome in an institutional environment still processing the prisoner counts from the latest encirclement as evidence that the campaign was proceeding on schedule. The autumn arrived in the second week of October 1941, and it arrived as it always arrived on the Russian plain, not gradually as a European autumn does, but as a condition that changed overnight and did not change back. The dirt roads that had slowed Wagner's supply columns through the summer
became something that the German army's own reports struggled to describe in language that conveyed what movement across them actually required. The Russian word for the season, Raspuchitsa, the time of no roads, had no direct German equivalent, which was itself a kind of answer to the question of how thoroughly the operational planners had absorbed the country they had chosen to invade. Trucks sank to their axles in mud that had the consistency and the grip of wet concrete. Horses died in harness pulling loads that the ground refused to release. Supply columns that had been scheduled to cover 40 kilometers in a day covered 4 or 2 or stopped entirely and waited for a freeze that was still weeks away. Wagner's correspondence from October 1941 records a man performing triage on a system that had passed beyond the point where triage was sufficient. He was allocating what existed, fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, across competing demands that collectively exceeded the supply available by margins that were no longer bridgeable by improvisation. The forward divisions of Army Group Center, driving toward Moscow in the opening weeks of Operation Typhoon, were receiving ammunition resupply at rates that required their commanders to ration fire. Artillery units that had expended their stocks in the encirclement battles at Vyazma and Bryansk waited days for replenishment that arrived in partial quantities. Panzer units that had driven their vehicles across 1,500 kilometers of Soviet roads since June were operating machines whose mechanical condition had long since passed the threshold at which the maintenance manual specified overhaul, because the spare parts and the workshop time that overhaul required were not available at the front. The clothing situation was the most visible failure because it was written on the men themselves. German soldiers who had crossed the Soviet border in June wearing summer uniforms were standing in October sleet in the same uniforms, supplemented by whatever they had been able to acquire locally or strip from Soviet prisoners and dead. The German army had not shipped winter clothing to the Eastern Front in sufficient quantities because the campaign was not supposed to require it. That decision was made at the planning level, based on the assumption that the army would be in winter quarters inside a defeated Soviet Union before the cold arrived. Wagner's office had flagged the clothing shortfall in September when it was already too late to correct it through normal supply channels. A public collection of winter clothing from German civilians was organized in late 1941, a spectacle that told the German population something about the campaign's progress that the official communiques had not mentioned.
Thomas, watching the production figures accumulate on his desk in the autumn, found in them the precise confirmation of every projection his memorandum had made. German tank production in 1941 was insufficient to replace the losses the Eastern Front was generating. The Wehrmacht had committed to Barbarossa approximately 3,600 tanks. By the autumn, combat losses, mechanical breakdown, and the accumulated damage of operating armored vehicles at extreme range without adequate maintenance had reduced the operational tank strength of the Eastern armies to a fraction of that figure. The monthly production of replacement tanks, approximately 250 per month in 1941, could not restore what the campaign was consuming. Thomas had calculated this before the campaign began and had submitted the calculation to the people responsible for the decision. He had been told that the calculation would not be needed because the campaign would be over before the deficit became critical. The deficit was now critical, and the campaign was not over. The temperature in the forward positions of Army Group Center fell below -20 in November, then below -30 in December. Weapons designed and lubricated for European conditions seized in the cold. Tank engines that had run 1,500 kilometers without overhaul refused to start in the morning, even after fires were lit beneath them. Men who survived the summer and the autumn began dying not from Soviet action, but from exposure in positions they could not leave because the orders required them to hold, and the supply system could not deliver the fuel and clothing that would shortfalls that each day's advance made worse.
The roads that the advance required were destroying the vehicles that the advance consumed. The Soviet road network west of the Dvina and Dnieper rivers consisted primarily of unpaved tracks whose surfaces disintegrated under military traffic, the dust of dry weather infiltrating engines and transmissions, the mud of wet weather immobilizing vehicles whose power could not overcome resistance that pavement would have eliminated. Prüller recorded truck losses in his diary with the precision his clerical training demanded. Breakdowns per day, vehicles awaiting repair, vehicles beyond repair, the inventory shrinking against requirements that remained constant or grew. The division's organic transport capacity was diminishing as the distances that transport needed to cover were increasing, the curves crossing in territory where no replacement could reach and no repair could be accomplished. The fuel situation that governed everything mechanized operations attempted was becoming critical faster than the advance was achieving objectives that fuel expenditure was supposed to secure. A Panzer division in sustained operations consumed approximately 30,000 gallons of fuel daily, a requirement that division supply personnel like Prüller were responsible for meeting through allocations that Army and Corps headquarters provided from stocks that railroad delivery had accumulated. The railroads were not keeping pace with the advance. Conversion lagged behind forward movement. Soviet demolitions destroyed facilities faster than German engineers could repair them. The gap between functioning railheads and combat units widened with each day's progress. Fuel was rationed, then severely rationed, then available only for operations that command authority specifically approved. The diary entries from July reflected frustration that professional responsibility could not resolve. Prüller recorded requests submitted and unfulfilled, allocations promised and reduced, the improvisations that necessity demanded and that regulations nominally prohibited. Units that needed fuel received fractions of requirements. Vehicles that needed parts waited for convoys that did not arrive. Horses that needed fodder competed with soldiers who needed food for space in wagons whose capacity could not serve both needs adequately. The campaign that had begun in confidence was already straining against limitations that confidence had dismissed, the supply system reaching toward a breaking point that the front lines had not yet reached, but that supply personnel could see approaching with each kilometer the front lines advanced.
Wagner observed the campaign's unfolding from the Quartermaster General's headquarters with the grim confirmation of predictions he had hoped would prove wrong. The reports that accumulated on his desk through July and August documented deterioration that his pre-war studies had forecast and that operational optimism had dismissed. Railroad conversion lagging weeks behind the advancing front, truck fleets shrinking to fractions of their initial strength, horse casualties mounting into figures that replacement could not approach. The smell of his headquarters was paper and tobacco smoke, and the particular tension of men managing systems whose failure they could document but not prevent. The campaign was succeeding tactically in ways that made strategic failure more certain, each victory carrying German forces deeper into territory that German logistics could not sustain. The railroad situation that Wagner monitored deteriorated faster than even pessimistic assessments had suggested. By mid-July, the gap between functioning German-gauge railheads and the advancing front exceeded 500 kilometers along most axes of advance, the precise distance his studies had identified as the supply system's maximum sustainable reach. Soviet demolitions had proven more thorough than expected, destroying not merely track, but bridges, water towers, repair facilities, signaling equipment, every component that functioning rail systems required. The engineering troops assigned to conversion and repair were working at capacity that exhaustion was degrading, their efforts producing perhaps 20 kilometers of restored line per day,
against requirements that grew by 40 or 50 kilometers as the front advanced. The gap was widening mathematically, the logistics system falling further behind with each tactical success. The motor transport that was supposed to bridge this gap was dying on roads that were killing it. Wagner's reports documented truck losses averaging nearly 25% of operational strength per month, a rate that would eliminate the entire motor transport fleet within 4 months if operations continued without massive replacement that German industry could not provide. The causes were cumulative and mutually reinforcing: roads that destroyed tires and suspensions, dust that clogged filters and scored cylinders, overloading that stressed components beyond design limits, maintenance postponed because maintenance facilities could not keep pace with advancing units. The trucks that survived were consuming fuel to deliver fuel, the net delivery diminishing as distances grew, the mathematics approaching the point where transport consumed as much as it delivered. The horse situation that supplemented motor transport was becoming a catastrophe whose scale exceeded anything German planning had contemplated. Wagner received reports indicating losses of over 1,000 horses per day from exhaustion, disease, starvation, and enemy action, a rate that would eliminate the entire horse population supporting the Eastern Campaign within 18 months. The fodder required to sustain surviving animals competed with supplies for human soldiers, the competition increasingly resolved in favor of men whose value commanders understood more immediately than they understood the transport capacity that horses represented. Horses that did not receive adequate fodder weakened. Their weakening reduced their carrying capacity. The reduced capacity meant fewer supplies reached forward units. The reduced supplies included fodder for horses whose weakening accelerated. The spiral was consuming itself. The ammunition situation that combat operations generated reflected all other failures in concentrated form. A German infantry division in sustained combat consumed approximately 300 tons of ammunition daily, a requirement that supply allocation struggled to meet even when transportation functioned adequately. The transportation was not functioning adequately. Units reported ammunition stocks falling below levels that doctrine considered minimum for continued operations. Artillery batteries rationing shells that tactical situations demanded they expend freely. Infantry companies facing combat with rifle rounds counted and grenades hoarded. The victories that German forces were achieving were victories won despite logistics rather than because of it. Tactical excellence compensating temporarily for systemic failure that tactical excellence could not permanently overcome. Wagner transmitted warnings through channels that professional responsibility required to use and that command dynamics ensured would produce no response adequate to the problems warnings identified. He documented the supply situation's deterioration in reports whose precision could not be disputed and whose implications were consistently dismissed. The campaign would succeed because it must succeed, because political decisions had committed Germany to objectives that logistics could not support, because acknowledging supply limitations would require acknowledging that decisions already made had been wrong. The Quartermaster General's function was to supply operations that command ordered, not to question whether operations command ordered could be supplied. Wagner performed this function while watching the predictions his pre-war studies had made materialize in suffering that his studies had also predicted and that his function could not prevent.
Prüller's diary entries from September and October 1941 documented the progressive strangulation of German offensive capability through shortages that no tactical success could resolve. The summer's dust had given way to autumn's mud as rains transformed the unpaved roads into channels of resistance that immobilized vehicles whose mechanical condition was already compromised. The smell of the supply dumps he managed changed.
less fuel, more decay, the particular odor of rations whose storage had exceeded their intended duration, and equipment whose maintenance had been deferred beyond what function could tolerate. The advance that had seemed unstoppable in June was grinding toward culmination not because Soviet resistance had strengthened, though it had, but because the sinews that sustained movement were severing faster than any effort could repair them. The entries recorded specific shortages with the precision that Prüller's clerical training demanded and that his duties required. Fuel allocations for the 9th Panzer Division had fallen to approximately 30% of operational requirements, forcing commanders to choose which vehicles would move and which would remain stationary regardless of tactical needs. Ammunition stocks had dropped below the 3-day supply that regulations considered minimum, individual batteries counting shells with care that peacetime training had never required. Ration deliveries had become irregular to the point of unpredictability, the field kitchens that sustained soldiers' strength and morale dependent on whatever Prüller's supply section could procure through official channels that functioned sporadically and unofficial expedients that regulations nominally prohibited. The winter equipment that the campaign's timeline had assumed would be unnecessary had not been shipped forward because logistics capacity could not accommodate items that planning had designated low priority. Prüller noted the absence in entries whose matter-of-fact tone could not conceal the implications that absence would produce. The greatcoats and winter boots and cold-weather lubricants that operations in Russian winter would require remained in depots in Germany and Poland, their transportation deferred in favor of ammunition and fuel whose immediate need seemed more urgent than clothing whose need remained theoretical while autumn temperatures persisted. The theory would become reality within weeks. The temperatures would drop toward levels that German soldiers had never experienced, and the equipment that might have preserved their combat effectiveness would still be hundreds of kilometers to the rear. The horses that pulled supply wagons were dying at rates that Prüller recorded with increasing alarm. His division had entered the Soviet Union with approximately 1,700 horses supporting its logistical operations. By October, fewer than 1,100 remained capable of work. The losses reflected accumulated stresses that inadequate fodder and excessive labor had imposed on animals, worked beyond their endurance, fed below their requirements, maintained below the standards that animal health demanded. Each horse that died reduced the transport capacity that supply operations required. The reduction meaning fewer supplies reached forward units, the reduced supplies including the fodder that surviving horses needed. The mathematics was consuming itself in animal flesh, the spiral accelerating as the animals it depended on expired. The improvisation that circumstances demanded produced solutions whose inadequacy could be measured in what they could not accomplish. Prüller organized foraging parties that stripped the surrounding countryside of whatever food and fodder it contained, the procurement supplementing official allocations that official channels could not deliver. He coordinated with supply personnel from neighboring units to share transportation assets whose pooling might accomplish what individual division resources could not. He maintained equipment beyond its operational lifespan through repairs whose expedient nature reflected available materials rather than engineering standards. The improvisation kept units functioning at levels below requirements but above complete failure, the margin narrowing as autumn progressed and winter approached. The diary entries from late October reflected exhaustion that professional determination could not entirely mask. Prüller wrote of working 18-hour days that produced results inadequate to needs, of calculations that showed requirements exceeding availability by margins that no effort could close, of the gap between what divisions needed and what supply sections could provide, widening toward dimensions that combat effectiveness could not survive. The advance that had conquered territory equivalent to Western Europe's largest nations was reaching a culminating point that enemy action had not imposed, but that logistics failure had made inevitable. The advance was dying of starvation, while soldiers who had accomplished it faced winter in summer uniforms, because the supply system that could not feed the advance could not clothe the soldiers who had made it. The winter that arrived in November 1941 transformed logistics failure into logistics catastrophe with a thoroughness that exceeded Wagner's most pessimistic projections. The temperatures that descended across the Eastern Front reached levels that German soldiers had never experienced and that German equipment had never been designed to withstand. 30 degrees below zero, then 40, conditions that froze lubricants in engines, shattered metal components whose steel became brittle, killed men whose clothing could not preserve the warmth their bodies generated. The smell of Wagner's headquarters remained paper and smoke, but the reports that produced the smell described suffering whose scale the words could only approximate. An army freezing in positions it could not retreat from because retreat required fuel that the supply system could not deliver.
The railroad network that sustained German operations seized up as temperatures dropped below the thresholds that equipment could tolerate. Locomotives whose boilers had not been designed for extreme cold cracked as water froze in pipes that expansion burst, each failure removing capacity that replacement could not restore. The trains that could still function moved at fractions of normal speed, their crews fighting conditions that slowed every operation and complicated every procedure. The rail lines themselves contracted in the cold, gaps opening between sections that warmer weather had kept connected, derailments multiplying as track integrity deteriorated. Wagner received reports indicating that rail throughput had fallen to perhaps 25% of autumn levels at precisely the moment when throughput needed to increase to deliver the winter equipment whose absence was killing his soldiers. The motor transport that had been inadequate in summer became nearly useless in winter. Engines that lacked cold weather lubricants froze solid, their oil congealing into substances that moving parts could not displace, their fuel gelling in lines that could not deliver it to cylinders that could not compress it. The antifreeze that might have prevented radiators from bursting had not been shipped forward in adequate quantities, vehicle after vehicle destroyed by ice expansion that proper preparation would have prevented. Prüller recorded in his diary the morning ritual that winter imposed. Fires built beneath engines to warm them enough to start. Hours consumed in procedures that summer had not required. The time lost subtracting from the transportation capacity that time represented. The trucks that could be made to function operated on roads whose frozen surfaces were actually superior to autumn mud, but the trucks that could be made to function numbered fractions of what operations required. The horses that had been dying through autumn died faster in winter, as cold compounded the stresses that exhaustion and malnutrition had already imposed. Wagner's reports documented horse losses exceeding 1,000 animals per day in December, the cumulative total since the campaign began approaching 200,000, nearly a third of the horses that had crossed the frontier in June. The surviving animals were weakened beyond effective service, their capacity to pull loads diminished by conditions that hay and oats might have mitigated, but that inadequate fodder made fatal. The supply wagons that horses pulled moved smaller loads shorter distances as the animals that pulled them failed, the failure reducing deliveries of fodder that might have preserved horses whose failure was reducing deliveries. The spiral completed itself in frozen carcasses that lined the roads the supply system could no longer use. The soldiers who depended on this collapsing system faced winter in clothing designed for European autumn. Wagner had attempted to prioritize winter equipment shipments as temperatures dropped, had argued for transportation allocation that competing demands made impossible to secure. The greatcoats and felt boots and fur caps that might have preserved combat effectiveness remained in rear depots,
while men at the front wrapped themselves in whatever they could find: blankets, civilian clothing stripped from abandoned houses, straw stuffed into summer boots that could not retain warmth that straw could not generate. Frostbite casualties mounted into tens of thousands, men whose frozen extremities required amputation that medical facilities could not provide, whose evacuation to rear areas the transportation system could not accomplish. The offensive that had been intended to capture Moscow before winter halted within sight of the Soviet capital, its momentum exhausted by logistics failure that enemy resistance had exploited but not caused. Wagner watched the culmination from headquarters whose distance from the front provided no protection from the professional responsibility he bore for a system whose limitations he had identified and could not overcome. The campaign had reached the point his pre-war studies had predicted, the point where consumption exceeded delivery, where advance became impossible not because soldiers could not fight, but because supplies could not reach them, where the army began dying of causes that enemy action supplemented but did not create. The mathematics of logistics had proved more powerful than the tactics of blitzkrieg, the distances of Russia more decisive than the victories German arms had won across them.
The pattern that the winter of 1941-42 established repeated through subsequent years, with variations that confirmed rather than contradicted its essential features. Wagner managed logistics for the 1942 summer offensive toward Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields, watching the same constraints produce the same consequences across distances even greater than 1941 had imposed. Prüller's diary documented the same shortages recurring with the same inexorability, each offensive reaching a culminating point that enemy action exploited but that supply failure had created. The Army learned nothing from experience because learning would have required acknowledging limitations that strategic ambition could not accept, would have demanded adjustments that political decisions precluded, would have meant abandoning objectives that logistics could not support. The 1942 campaign demonstrated logistics failure's cumulative effects with clarity that hindsight makes obvious and that contemporaneous optimism obscured. The advance toward Stalingrad stretched supply lines across hundreds of kilometers of steppe, whose infrastructure was even more primitive than the territories 1941 had traversed. The railroads that served this region were sparse, their conversion demanding resources that competing requirements could not spare, their capacity, when converted, insufficient for the forces they were supposed to sustain. Wagner's staff calculated requirements and compared them to capabilities with the precision that staff work demanded, the calculations consistently showing deficits that no organizational improvement could eliminate. The calculations were noted and filed and produced no alteration in plans whose logistics implications had been acknowledged and dismissed. Prüller experienced the 1942 campaign from positions that had become grimly familiar, his diary entries recording shortages whose categories were identical to the previous year and whose severity was often worse. The 9th Panzer Division advanced toward objectives that fuel supplies could not sustain reaching, ammunition stocks that combat consumption depleted faster than delivery restored, rations whose irregularity had become the norm rather than the exception. The improvisations that had preserved minimal function in 1941 were refined through experience without becoming adequate through refinement, the margins of failure narrowing but never closing, the system perpetually operating below requirements that perpetually exceeded capacity. The Stalingrad encirclement that November 1942 produced demonstrated what happened when logistics failure reached its terminal phase. The Sixth Army that Soviet forces surrounded had been supplied through a single railroad line whose interdiction severed the connection between an army and the logistics system that sustained it. The airlift that was supposed to replace ground supply
delivered fractions of requirements, perhaps 100 tons daily against minimum needs exceeding 500 tons, the gap representing the starvation and ammunition exhaustion and medical supply depletion that would destroy the army as certainly as Soviet artillery. Wagner observed this destruction from headquarters, whose distance provided no insulation from professional responsibility for systems whose failure he had predicted and could not prevent. The 1943 campaigns saw the pattern continue in defensive operations that logistics constrained as thoroughly as it had constrained offensives. Units that attempted to hold positions required supplies that the logistics system struggled to deliver, the ammunition that defensive combat consumed, competing with fuel that mobile reserves required, competing with rations that soldiers needed to maintain strength for combat that never paused long enough for adequate resupply. The Soviet offensives that progressively pushed German forces westward were exploiting logistics vulnerabilities as systematically as they exploited tactical opportunities, striking at supply lines whose interdiction produced effects that direct combat could not match. Prüller's diary entries from this period reflected the exhaustion of a man managing a system that never functioned adequately and that continued declining. The division he served had been rebuilt after winter losses, rebuilt again after summer losses, rebuilt yet again with replacements whose training reflected abbreviated programs that manpower shortages imposed and whose equipment reflected the compromises that production limitations demanded. Each rebuilding produced a formation less capable than its predecessor, the decline reflecting not merely personnel quality, but the logistics infrastructure that could not equip and sustain formations at standards earlier campaigns had maintained. Wagner's professional assessment of the situation had evolved into something approaching despair that professional discipline could not entirely suppress. The system he managed was not failing because of incompetence or inadequate effort. It was failing because it was being asked to accomplish what no system could accomplish, to sustain operations across distances that supply mathematics made impossible, to support strategic ambitions that logistics reality could not fulfill. His pre-war warnings were correct. Their correctness had prevented nothing, had altered no decisions, had produced no adjustment in plans whose logistics impossibility had been acknowledged and dismissed. The army was being destroyed by constraints he had identified before the campaign began, and his identification had changed nothing except his own complicity in the destruction his identification had not prevented.
The conspiracy Wagner joined in 1944 reflected convictions that logistics experience had shaped as thoroughly as moral considerations had motivated. The July 20th plot that attempted to assassinate Hitler and end the war drew participants from across the German military establishment, officers whose professional judgment had concluded that continuation meant destruction and whose patriotism demanded they act to prevent what obedience was producing. Wagner's participation was known to the conspirators who planned the operation. His role intended to involve the logistics apparatus he controlled in the new government that assassination was supposed to enable. The attempt failed. The bomb detonated, but Hitler survived, and the conspirators faced consequences that survival had made inevitable. Wagner received news of the plot's failure on July 21 with the understanding of a man whose professional calculations had always included assessment of probabilities, and whose assessment of these probabilities left no room for hope. The Gestapo investigations that followed the assassination attempt were identifying conspirators with efficiency that reflected both investigative capability and the willingness of some participants to name others under interrogation. Wagner's involvement would certainly be discovered. Too many knew of his sympathies. Too many had discussed the conspiracy in his presence. Too many documents and witnesses would connect him to planning that failure had transformed from patriotism to treason.
The choice he faced was between the interrogation and show trial that capture would bring and the alternative that his service pistol could provide. He chose the pistol on July 23, 1944, at his headquarters, the shot ending a life that logistics experience had shaped and that logistics failure had taught to despair. The Quartermaster General, who had warned that the Eastern Front could not be sustained, who had watched his warnings materialize into suffering he could document but not prevent, who had managed the impossible for 3 years while the impossible consumed the army he served, this officer ended his service with a bullet rather than face the degradation that Nazi justice would impose. His death was recorded as suicide, his motivations left for history to assess, his professional legacy preserved in the studies that had predicted what the campaign had confirmed. Prüller learned of the assassination attempt and its aftermath through the channels that military information followed and that military discipline required him to accept without visible reaction. His diary entries from this period are notably sparse, the caution that dangerous times demanded, suppressing the documentation that earlier periods had produced. The supply work that occupied his days continued with the routines that 3 years had established, the shortages that had become normal, the improvisations that had become standard, the system functioning inadequately as it had always functioned inadequately, while the front lines it supplied contracted toward the Reich, whose defense could no longer be sustained. The war's final months carried Prüller westward with the retreating forces, whose logistics he continued managing until management became impossible and survival became the only purpose that circumstances permitted. The diary that documented the Eastern Front's logistics from the supply sergeant's perspective accompanied him through the chaos that 1945 imposed, its pages recording the campaign's end as they had recorded its beginning and its long deterioration. He survived the war's conclusion, was captured by American forces whose interest in German supply personnel was limited, was processed through prisoner of war procedures whose bureaucratic character must have seemed familiar to a man whose military service had consisted largely of bureaucratic functions performed under impossible conditions. The post-war decades allowed Prüller to preserve the documentation that wartime had produced, his diary eventually published as a record of what the Eastern Front had looked like from perspectives that general officers' memoirs did not provide. He returned to clerical work in the Austria that occupation had divided and that peace eventually restored to something approaching normalcy. His military service a memory, whose documentation he maintained with the precision that documentation had always demanded from him. The shortages he had recorded, the failures he had witnessed, the system whose inadequacy he had experienced daily for 4 years, these became historical evidence rather than lived reality, their significance available for those whose interest in understanding might benefit from what his diary preserved. Prüller died on March 17, 2003, in Vienna, the city of his birth, at the age of 86. His diary remained in print, consulted by historians whose interest in logistics had taught them that wars are won and lost by supply as much as by combat, that the Eastern Front's outcome had been determined by constraints that Wagner had identified before it began, and that Prüller had documented as they strangled German offensive capability. The army that had invaded the Soviet Union, expecting victory within weeks, had been destroyed by distances that supply could not span, by requirements that delivery could not meet, by mathematics whose implications planning had acknowledged and decisions had dismissed. Wagner had warned, Prüller had witnessed, the army had died. The logistics failure that both men had experienced from their different positions had proven more decisive than any battle, had determined outcomes that combat had merely confirmed, had demonstrated that wars are fought by soldiers but sustained by systems whose failure no soldier's courage can overcome.